Good evening and welcome. Welcome to another edition of Attlas Live. And tonight we are going to be discussing a topic which is one which we encounter all the time, especially online. It's a term, a phrase, an understanding which people often use, and it is one which is problematic for those on the path because it is much misunderstood. It is used flippantly, casually, without any real in-depth grasp of what the phrase actually is referring to, what it means, and what the implications are. That phrase is, of course, what we call, or what we've often heard called, shadow work. And tonight, we are going to embark on unveiling just what this so-called shadow work is. And we are going to do so from the perspective of Carl Jung himself at the outset. And we will progress through our own examination and analysis. And we will end with Carl Jung again. And recognize that Carl Jung was an esotericist. He was a mystic. But he was also very much a man of his time and conditioned, if you will, and very much trapped within his own shadow. But there are profound glimmers of insight and truth into his works and in his teachings. Sadly, like most teachings, like most scripture, like most texts or theories or expressions of psychology and mysticism and esotericism, the truth needs to be extracted. The truth is not on the surface. And far too often, individuals, including those calling themselves seekers or light workers or healers or star seeds or initiates or whatever title they use to self-identify as one who is a seeker of the light, who is a seeker of knowledge, who's a seeker of higher planes of existence, of divinity. Very often they rely on their ego mind and superficial literal interpretations, including those of Jung. And we can hear intellectuals the world over reacting to that statement, saying, but Jung is very clear. He's very systematic. He maps it all out. It's very clear. There is no room for interpretation. There is no room for misunderstanding. Well, we will see tonight that there is room for precisely that, because it was Jung himself who misunderstood the very intuitions which he was receiving. And he allowed his ego mind to take the fundamental underlying truths which he had insight into, and formulate them in such a way that those underlying truths became obscured under this framework, which now far too many people interact with on the surface level and believe that's what it is. And that's what it's all about. The so-called shadow work and the so-called integration of the shadow. And we will see how that's simply not possible. It's simply, and it's antithetical to the spiritual path. So we will begin tonight then, because we have a fairly full house already. So without further ado, we're going to dive into it. As always, we do encourage you to ask questions and interact as much as possible. Having said that, we did prepare a fairly lengthy deck of slides for this evening. When we say prepare, we're recycling a lot of these from other PowerPoints. But the point is that we do have a lot of material to cover. And we want to make this as practical and as meaningful to you as possible, meaning we want you to be able to walk away from this having a fuller, richer, deeper understanding and comprehension for what this so-called shadow work really is and what it is not. So, without further ado, let's begin by looking at this word, this phrase, shadow work, and looking at the origins of it. Where does this come from, the shadow self? Now, we mentioned Carl Jung, and of course, he coined the term, the famous 20th century psychologist and protege of Sigmund Freud. And he said, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. He also said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. These are probably two of the most well-known, if the two most well-known quotations by Carl Jung. And we will get into more of his words eventually. But we want to first provide the esoteric context for those words to see if we can bring greater meaning to them. But these two phrases we offer as an overview as to what was inspiring Carl Jung's work, these insights that there is this unconscious nature. He called it the shadow self, an unconscious self. And that if it remains unconscious, it grows, it strengthens. And not only that, it enacts greater influence in our life. These two sentiments are very important because they express a universal truth. They express an absolute objective reality for each and every one of us. It's unfortunately where Carl Jung took this and where most people take this and see this and understand this and work with this, that ends up being problematic. So let's see why that is. First of all, as another brief, very brief 80,000 foot pass over Carl Jung's work, this is his worldview of the microcosm. This is how he saw the individual psyche. We had the outer world. We have the persona, which is the most exoteric layer of the psyche, our personality that we interact with the outer world with. Beneath the personality, the persona, we have the ego. That's that sense of I, that sense of that I-ness, and all of those factors relating to our individuality as an I, and then beneath that is the self at the center, whatever that self is, the amness, the beingness, the being. Now, of course, this was all on the conscious level. On the unconscious level, there is what Jung referred to as the shadow. And then beneath the shadow was the animus anima, which related to the collective unconscious. And then all of this was in the inner world, or the inner world of the self, the inner psychology. Now, we're not going to break this down or go into any more detail because, number one, we're not an expert on Jung, and we're not going to delve or dwell too much on this. Our interest, because we're talking about shadow work, is to focus on this aspect that he refers to as the shadow, and because people talk about the shadow work all the time and doing the shadow work. So that's really our focus on tonight's talk. This is what relates to the shadow in Jung's worldview. What you have around the perimeter here are 12 archetypes, 12 archetypal personalities or ego types. And these are the good archetypes on the outer rim here. So ruler, hero, the innocent, the explorer, sage, outlaw, magician, jester, lover, everyman, caregiver, creator. And each one of these archetypes has a value associated with it, a propensity, a attribute. And they are, for example, mastery, safety, freedom, knowledge, liberation, power, pleasure, intimacy. Now, these are already problematic in our view. How these attributes are attributed to a single archetype, when in reality, some of these attributes are so broad, or that he was creating an amalgamation of personas by amalgamating multiple archetypes. But the point that he was on about was the fact that every good archetype has its shadow. So, for example, the hero, the shadow of the hero is the villain. The shadow of the innocent is the victim. So, the shadow of the explorer is the raider, etc., etc. And Jung was adamant that individuals needed to become conscious and aware of their shadow archetype. They had to first know what archetypes they fall into in terms of a persona, but then they had to be aware that this shadow archetype existed, and they had to become conscious of that. And if they didn't, this shadow would end up ruling their life, and they wouldn't know why they were being subjected to all of this suffering. Meanwhile, it was because they were ignorant of their shadow. And so this is where the term shadow work comes into play. And it is this integration of the shadow that leads to things like this meme where, oh, you know what? We should be doing these slides like this. So we apologize for that. Let's go back one slide so you can see more clearly what some of these archetypes were. Because the type is quite small. So again, just very quickly, you have the good archetypes, and then each archetype has its shadow and a related virtue or attribute. And so when we talk about the integration of the shadow, we end up with memes like this one, where you have, of course, the love and light crowd, which believe only in positivity and affirmations, and everything's positive, 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 positive. So you have the Jungians who come along and say, no, 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 I'm gonna push you into embracing the darkness, embracing your darkness. And this is the first and most prominent misconception and fallacy related to shadow work. And it's a very fine line between accepting our shadow, accepting the darkness within us, and embracing it, integrating it. There's a fine line here which separates those two actions. Because when you embrace something, the implication is that it's good. It's a part of you, and you want it to be a part of you, and you're going to utilize it and make use of it. And that's very much how Carl Jung felt. So that because you have this shadow self, and so it's a part of you. So that is what makes you whole. Whereas accepting one's shadow is accepting, okay, I have this dark side, and it's very real, and I see it, and I know it, I observe it, I'm aware of it, I'm conscious of it, but I don't embrace it. I accept it without embracing it. That's the difference between an alcoholic who knows they're an alcoholic but is sober, and an alcoholic who knows they're an alcoholic and drinks. Both of them accept that they're alcoholics. Well, not necessarily, because, of course, the alcoholic who drinks might be in denial of being an alcoholic, in which case they're not aware of their shadow. Their shadow is ruling their life, as Carl Jung said, because it's unconscious. Their alcoholism, the demon, Al-Kul, is ruling their life, and they were calling it fate, just as Carl Jung said, because it's unconscious, subconscious. They have not stood up in a room with 12 other people, raised their right hand and said, I'm so-and-so and I'm an alcoholic. They have not done that yet. But so the first step in the 12-step program is someone has to stand up and say, I'm so-and-so and I'm an alcoholic. They have to admit it publicly, or at least within that space of alcoholics and their sponsors, and they have to admit it themselves. This is an acceptance. This is owning your shadow. This is owning the demon that haunts you. But this is not the same as embracing the demon. So this is the very first subtle nuance, which we would say 90%, if not more, 95% of people who just read Jung or hear this word shadow work or just have a vague understanding of what this is all about believe. In fact, here's what a website said about it. The idea of shadow work, then, is acknowledging all parts of the psyche, effectively bringing what is dark into the light. You can't have balance without both the dark and the light. Shadow work actualizes living a multifaceted life that incorporates the good, the bad, the beautiful, the ugly, the embarrassing, the uncertain, all of it. Now, we tried to find a website which was not wholly new age or whatever, but that's right on the cusp, right on the border of that self-help and new age type sort of pseudo-psychology or magazine level psychology, if we want to call it that. And this website was called scarymommy.com, which we thought was humorous in and of itself. So let's go on here to another. How do you run from what's inside your head? This is a meme that we just pulled off the internet. And this, of course, again, this website, scarymommy.com, expresses some of Carl Jung's more esoteric understandings. Here's where things could get a little too, how do we say this? Paranormal for some people. In certain camps, the shadow self is referred to as a demon. The idea is that whatever parts of ourselves we disown turn against us, manifesting as a sort of paranormal entity. That entity can operate on its own without our knowledge, which can result in situations we end up regretting. It's all very Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but demonic. The idea here, the implication, is that, well, if you have this demon inside of you, it's better that you know the demon intimately and that you integrate the demon into your life than it is to ignore it or try to run from it. Because if you ignore it or try to run from it, it's going to end up ruling your life. And we briefly touched on that in the alcoholism example. Because clearly, you can't run from it. You can't hide from it. Genevieve says, if I saw a kind of demon as a kid, it could be possible it's my shadow self. Let's try to understand as well that this whole term shadow self is a misnomer. The entire concept, and we'll get into that. So we'll answer that question. Demons haunt us, and they are what cause us to be unconscious. The demons are in the subconscious. But this whole issue around the shadow self itself is a misnomer. And we are in the process of deconstructing, if you will, of breaking down, of analyzing this term, shadow self and shadow work, and getting at the real meat and potatoes of it, the down-to-earth practicality of being able to understand and comprehend. So right away, this term shadow self is problematic because it creates a dichotomy between our self, the I that we identify with, and some shadow self lurking in our subconsciousness or in our unconscious mind. That's this other version of us. When in reality, those two things are one and the same. And we will demonstrate that. We will prove that to you. That's not this is not a theory or anything else. We're going to show you how that is. Okay. So this article continues on, and we chose it specifically because of the way it approached the material. So uncovering the things festering just below the surface can lead to healing, and healing can lead to wholeness, which in turn translates into things like improved relationships and a clearer perception of self. Yeah, how? Why? It's never discussed, it's never mentioned. You see here this vague language and this vague thing, well, uncovering the things festering below the surface. What things? And it can lead to healing, and healing leads to wholeness, which in turn translates into good stuff. How? Why? Nobody knows. Nobody says. But this is shadow work. Devout believers in shadow work even insist it can lead to enhanced energy and renewed physical health. It actually makes sense if you think about it. When you're emotionally tapped out, it can make you feel exhausted in every way. The argument here is that if you aren't embracing your full, authentic self, you're living in a perpetual state of emotional overextension. Cue constant fatigue. Okay, how? Why? What is, again, just vague statements saying, well, believers believe this. Well, if you are emotionally tapped out all the time, yeah, you will be exhausted. But how? Why? What is the mechanism? What is the process? And how does something in your unconscious mind emotionally tap you out? Doesn't say, doesn't explain anything, doesn't say what to look for, doesn't say how to do any of this. Repression is something that you're forcibly pushing under the rug. Your repressed emotions are something that you're actively pushing under the rug, or that because of some trauma, you've blocked out, but you've unconsciously or subconsciously blocked that out. So yes, of course, we've talked often about depression because we've suffered from depression ourselves. And we've explained often what depression is. It's a deep-seated subconscious rage. It's rage in the subconsciousness. And that's draining us of our energy. The number one symptom of depression is lack of energy, is exhaustion, mental exhaustion, emotional and physical exhaustion. The inability to get out of bed in the morning. It's because your mind has been raging all night and the previous day. So it's like you haven't even slept. But again, this says something, but it doesn't say how or why this something exists. And it doesn't say how or why doing shadow work is going to solve this problem. Because if you embrace your full authentic self, why would that which was draining you until now, why wouldn't it continue to drain you? Or you would have to feed it some other way. And we'll get into that in a minute. We're just trying to get through some of these sort of blanket statements that get made here. So sure, shadow work is worth a shot. They say, good, give it a try. Give it a try like it's a diet. You can always work with an expert or simply choose to stop if it truly does not turn out to be your thing. Again, like it's some fad diet or something. Who knows though? Maybe you'll unblock something inside and discover an untapped fount of physical, emotional, and spiritual energy. Yeah, how? Why? Ask anybody that does shadow work what they're doing, why they're doing it, and how they're doing it. So there's a huge issue. And all of this is simply dancing around the issue. But we're not going to dance around the issue tonight. The issues are with the shadow self and shadow work. First and foremost, is that it avoids and misunderstands and misrepresents what it means to be a true human being. In fact, integration of the shadow as understood by most people and as intimated on the surface of Jung's work is antithetical to being a true human being. It actually leads and promotes being a Hasnamusin, or one who has a dual center of gravity. And we'll demonstrate that. We're sort of we've gone through what Jung said and what other people think generally, what shadow work is and why it's beneficial. Now we're getting into the meat and potatoes as to breaking down what the big issues with it are. And then we're going to take a deep dive into them. So the second issue is this notion of ego versus egos. The misunderstanding and misinterpretation of what the ego is, of this idea that it is something valuable and appropriate and necessary to the self. And the misappropriation of the term egos to refer to that singular I, that sense of self. Then the big one is the integration of the shadow. This is the huge issue here around is this idea of integration and what that really means and what we're actually integrating from the shadow. And finally, the complete lack of comprehension of the proper application of the sexual force or the vital energy. You will hear, as we just read, people talking about how, well, if you don't integrate the shadow, it's going to drain you of all this energy and you're going to be emotionally exhausted. So, and they talk about, well, if you integrate the shadow, you will gain all sorts of energy and you have this potential to create new vitality. So they're touching on it, but they don't say how and why. They don't talk about the metaphysical mechanics of it, and they don't talk about the actual practical steps. So all of these are issues we're going to deal with systematically. And the reason why we're going to do it is because, let's just face it, the world is becoming more and more, day in and day out, more like the Planet of the Apes. The combination of human genetics and anthropology, paleoanthropology, and Darwinism, and the practice of contemporary psychology studying apes and chimpanzees to better understand humans has resulted in a contemporary psychology which basically conditions us and teaches human beings to become more ape-like. And this is not what a human being is. A human being is not an ape. Period. And any sort of resemblance between us and the great apes comes from the fact that the great apes are devolved humans. Exactly. And part of the reason why we have such problem and such misunderstanding and misconstrued and this whole shadow work nonsense is so misapplied is because people are identified with their monkey mind, and they're identified with what contemporary psychology says a human being is, which is basically an intellectual ape, an intellectual hominid, an intellectual animal. So if you do shadow work the way it appears on the surface and the way most people ascribe and the way that article is talking about it, yeah, you will create of yourself a fully fledged Hasna Musin. Part human, part ape. But the more of the ape-like self that you, the anima animus, right, that you integrate, the stronger and stronger and stronger ape-like you're going to become. And sure, you won't feel any resistance from it anymore because you're going to be embracing it. Embrace your ape-like nature. Why not? Don't fight it. Don't resist it. Embrace it. But look at the world. The planet of the apes. Now, in your heart, in your intuition, does that feel spiritual to you? If you come at it from certain spiritual frameworks like some Aboriginal or Native frameworks, that we're all just animals and we're all one with Gaia and we're all part of that, and again, it's limiting to this sphere of animal nature, of mechanical nature, and that we're all one with that, we're all part of that, then sure, you can too embrace your animal nature and you can become wild and savage like the animals are. And you can embrace that. No, but they will use all this beautiful language and flowery language around that. They're not, it's not savage, it's beautiful. It's not primal. It's beautiful. It's Mother Nature. It's anyway, let's continue. Now that we looked at what the origins of shadow work and what the shadow self was in terms of Jung and the terminology and people's understanding of it and people's way they work with it and approach to it, let's look at the origin of the actual shadow self. What creates the shadow that we need to, quote, work with? And by that, what creates the shadow within us? Yes, the New Age is always talking about beauty and energy. And beauty and energy is good, is important. But let's talk specifically about that beauty and that energy right now. Well, okay. So what Jung says is that if, for example, part of your persona, part of your ego personality is the hero archetype, Jung says that simultaneously there exists the villain in the subconsciousness. This is the shadow of the hero. And that through the attribute of mastery, there it is, through the attribute of mastery, you become this hero and you need to integrate all of this. The villain, you need to integrate the villain in order to achieve the mastery and be the hero. Because a hero without a villain can't be a hero. And archetypally, theoretically, in the abstract, right, he's not wrong. He's not wrong about that. So we have to be aware, we have to be conscious of the potentiality to be the villain. That the villain is lurking in our subconsciousness or unconsciousness. But how and why? Is this enough, in other words? We need to look at how the ray of creation, okay, descends down the tree of life and into our 3 brains and our 5 centers. And the sexual force, the creative force in the 9th sphere, this is the 4th dimension. This is the body of chi, prana, kundalini. This is the force, the living force that that operates in our mind, in our heart, and in our body. And if this force, and these slides shouldn't be advancing themselves, but they are, so if this force descends and inverts and becomes the destructive force, known as the dark side in Star Wars, and we fall, we become an inverted pentagram, in other words. And the 999 in each of our 3 brains becomes the 666 of our individual shaitan. And the sexual force, because it's not an upright 9, it's fallen. It's become a 6, and it flows down and out, and it creates the kunda buffer organ known as Satan's tail. And the sexual force becomes a wasted force. It becomes consumed. It becomes lost. This is how the shadow is created. Because the shadow has to be created. It doesn't just, the villain, going back to our hero example, and that's why Star Wars is a wonderful contemporary mythology and allegory to discuss this with, because we have the Jedi and the Sith. We have the heroes and the villains, and they use the same force. That force is either the creative force or a destructive force. But it's the same force. It has a light side and a dark side. And it is our egos, also known as sins, fear, anger, pride, greed, lust, laziness, that causes the 9 to invert and become a 6, causes us to fall, and creates this Satan's tail, the kunda buffer organ. This is the metaphysical process by which the ray of creation, which is the ray of Christ, the Christic force, descends from the absolute through all the sephira of the tree of life, which are inside of us, into the 9th sphere. And from there, through our own mistakes, through the abuse and misuse of the creative force, the creative energy, it becomes a destructive force in our life. By creating the inverse, by creating the shadow, for example, the villain. And so how do egos do that? Well, they do that by playing this game of King of the Hill inside of us. So, for example, any of our egos, they enslave our consciousness, right? And they consume our vital energy. And how do they do that? They do that through craving, I want this, and aversion, I don't want that. They do it through identification, I am the greatest, and rejection, I am the worst. And they work together through rationalization. They will like me if I do this, or irrationality. They all hate me. Your egos are not your friends. So this idea of integration, we've just seen that if the energy is not being used by the hero archetype, if you're not being the hero, the energy is in your consciousness is not being used by your inner hero, the true self, to be the hero, then it's being stolen along with the sexual force. It's being enslaved, and it is creating the villain in the subconscious, and if you embrace this, you can embrace it, but if you embrace it, you will be the villain. If you embrace it. So this idea of mastery, well, there are master black magicians. Like the Jedi and the Sith. There are Jedi who are masters, and then there are Sith masters. So mastery, as it relates to the hero or the villain, is simply means, what are you mastering? What have you embraced and what have you mastered? The hero or the villain? And what we know, not just from Jedi, from Star Wars, Jedi and Sith, we see them fall, we see them turn from the light side to the dark side. We know that that is the process of the fall. So the villain, the egos, master the hero. And they cause that hero to fall and become the villain. The potentiality is there, and the opportunity for redemption is there, and we'll talk about that as well. Your shadow is not your friend. The egos, which create the shadow, are not your friend. Ergo, your shadow is not your friend. Well, then what then is shadow work really? So again, we look at what created the shadow we need to work with, and what work do we need to do to reverse what we just saw. Well, here we're looking at, again, using Star Wars, the dark side of the Force. We've seen the ray of Christ descend and be perverted, be enslaved. Okay, Roy asks, what's the difference between egos and shadows? Practically speaking, there is no difference. The archetypes that Jung works with are simply effects. They're the inverse of the good archetype. So, for example, hero and villain. So the villain is the opposite of the hero. But what makes a villain? But the egos. Like, what turns a hero into a villain? You remember from the film The Dark Knight, there's a line that says, you know, if you're a hero long enough, or if you're a hero for long enough, you will see yourself become the villain. But what makes a hero a villain are precisely their egos, their flaws, their defects and vices, which cause them to fall. That's what every opera and every Shakespearean play, that's what every tragic hero is. The tragic hero is that great man, that virtuous human being who falls because of some vice, because of some tragic flaw. So the egos are the cause of the shadow. They constitute the how and why the shadow self exists. That's the only difference. Rich asks, I thought ergo in Greek meant work. Do you mean ergo or ego? Ego doesn't mean work. Ego means I. In Latin, at least. Off the top of our head, we don't know what ego means in Greek, but in Latin, ego means I. I be I. Ergo means therefore. Ergo means as a result of. So we're not talking about ergo, though. We're talking about ego. But ergo means as a result of. So again, ergo is related to cause and effect. Okay, let's continue. So the dark side of the Force. So of course, in Star Wars, they're called the Sith, which again, we're talking about 6 here, and then they talk about Order 66 in the prequel trilogy. Again, that's all related to the sexual force and how it's fallen. A 9 fallen becomes a 6. So a 9 fallen in each of our 3 brains becomes a 666. That's the number of the beast. So if all of this has created the shadow in us, when the obvious question is like, what do we do? So what does shadow work really actually entail? Or are we just going to just fall into oblivion? So the first step is to what we say, grow some backbone. And literally, we're talking about become an upright human being again. Stop abusing the sexual force in each of the 3 brains and the 5 centers. That's step 1. Stop allowing the egos to steal your vital energy, and stop allowing them to and we do this with willpower, which happens to be the 6th sephira on the tree of life, the causal body, and it's the human soul. To be an upright human being, we have to work with the spinal column. That is the staff of Moses. It's Gandalf's staff. Even Rey in Star Wars has a staff. And all of those staffs represent the same thing. They represent a straight, upright spinal column. We have to grow a spine. We have to grow some backbone. That's step 1 with the shadow work, is we have to stand upright ourself. You can't face your shadow as a weakling. You have to face your shadow as a warrior, upright and strong. And we stop abusing the sexual force, and so it's no longer destructive. It has to be creative, and we use it in the service of the will of our innermost being. This is what it means to be an initiate. In Star Wars, they call it a Padawan. And in Star Wars, you're given a light saber. That's an illuminated spinal column. So, of course, one of the big things about shadow work, as they describe it, and Jung describes it, is you have to make the unconscious conscious. Otherwise, it is a phantom menace. It lurks in the shadows. And you don't want our defects and vices. You don't want your egos. You don't want your egos having the ability to have free reign in the darkness of the subconscious mind. Because as Carl Jung says, they will rule your life. Again, coming back to the alcoholic who doesn't admit to themselves that they're an alcoholic. They're living in denial. That alcoholism rules their life. And it's not just alcoholism, could be any addiction. And as long as we remain unconscious of our defects and vices, they will manipulate us. They will pull our strings, and we're just their puppets. Proteus says, this is great stuff. I identify with the sage archetype and most certainly acknowledge the elitist dark side, Darth Sidious, to use the Star Wars theme. So what we work with then to illuminate the shadow, we work with our individual Lucifer. Lucifer means light bringer, bringer of light. Lucy, light, and fairy, to carry. So the carrier of light, the bringer of light. And here we see Divine Mother Columbia, Lady Liberty, holding aloft the great torch of liberty, the flame that illuminates the shadows. And so it is precisely with our Divine Mother that we must work. And we must work with our individual Lucifer, which shines the light on the shadows. And this is allegorized in the title of the film, The Force Awakens, which is the first title of the sequel trilogy, whereas The Phantom Menace is the first title of the prequel trilogy. And you see the relationship between those two things, between The Phantom Menace and The Force Awakening. The Force Awakens, the Kundalini awakens. We have our individual Lucifer shining the light on our shadow self, our inner Darth Sidious, our inner Darth Maul. So this brings us to working with the analogous ultimate methodology of psychology. And we do so, we come to this because that first step, shining the light on our shadow, is the first step of the analogous ultimate methodology, or Alm of Life. The popular term is mindfulness. We like to use this term self-observation. Self-observation and self-remembering. Self-observation of our 3 brains and 5 centers, and self-remembering. Who do we remember? We remember our Divine Mother, who is the one who holds aloft that torch, that flame, but also who orchestrates all the situations, all the circumstances in our life. Our Divine Mother is she who gives us all that we need in our life, on our path, on our journey, including all of our tests, trials, and ordeals, including all those people who show up in our life that piss us off, that drive us crazy. What are they doing? They're holding up a mirror to ourselves. They're forcing us to look at ourselves, and they are triggering those egos inside of us. And when those egos are triggered, they're brought to the surface. And when they're brought to the surface, we have a chance to see them. In other words, the light is being shone on them. Yes, Sophia, we're not quite there yet, but we'll get there. You're ahead of us, Proteus. You're ahead. You're ahead of us. So the next step is diagnosis. As we observe our 3 brains and our 5 centers, we want to go through the process of self-exposition, taking note of the psychological aggregates or egos responsible for the harm, for whatever's causing us suffering or whatever is causing us to cause others suffering. This, we call it self-exposition, not only because it's exposing ourselves, but it's the exposition as in becoming aware and admitting, accepting. For example, like journaling, where you write an exposition, an expose. It's being honest with ourselves. Not to beat ourselves up, not to berate ourselves, not to become our own worst critic, because that too is just a trick of the ego. But to diagnose what ego or what egos are at work is absolutely essential. You have to, like, think of it. Remember the article that we quoted talked about healing? How can you heal if you don't know what the disease is? How do you heal a disease if you have not diagnosed what the disease is? Impossible. Cannot happen. It doesn't matter what kind of physician, naturopath, allopath, it doesn't matter. Step 1 is you have to isolate the disease. You have to isolate the cause of the problem. That's why allopathic healthcare very rarely heals anything. They just treat symptoms because they don't really know the underlying causes of the disease. We look to the underlying causes of suffering. That's why the Jungian model of the shadow self itself is too limiting and it's too superficial. Because as we've shown, the hero and the villain archetype, that's great. Oh yeah, I have an inner villain. We all have an inner villain. Big deal. How valuable is it to know that? We all know that on some level. But what causes us to fall from hero to villain? That's what we need to know. And moment by moment by moment, when we have our little falls, when we fall, when we make our mistakes, when we see those terrible circumstances in which we are suffering or we're causing others to suffer, what is the cause of that suffering? We need to diagnose that. We need to have that diagnosis. Moment by moment. Okay, that was pride. Okay, that was fear. That's anger, but often anger is a mask of something else. There's greed, there's gluttony, there's laziness. We have to be able to constantly make this a part of our self-observation, the diagnosis. From there, we move into analysis. This can include journaling. This can absolutely means meditation, visualization, retrospection, introspection, contemplation. You will notice that none of these words are associated with thinking. This is not something we think about. We don't want to engage our ego mind to analyze our egos. We do not want to recruit the fox to watch the hen house. That's stupid. That's setting yourself up for disaster. The ego mind is not your friend. The ego mind is your adversary. You cannot rely on your ego mind to do this work, the so-called shadow work, if we're going to keep using that term. Your shadow is in the unconscious mind, the subconscious mind to begin with. And yes, perhaps it's come to the surface and you got a glimpse of this ego or that ego, but now you're going to rely on your ego mind to figure that out. It's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. You might think you figured things out, but all of that process of thinking that you're figuring things out, you're falling down the downward spiral deeper and deeper into hell. You're just being consumed. Your consciousness, more consciousness is being consumed by ego, and more energy is being sucked away by through your mental center by your egos. Even as they're convincing you that you're working things out, that you're figuring things out. Because they're gonna throw you a bone, and they're gonna hypnotize you, going to give you all sorts of rational arguments and rationalizations. And it's going to make a lot of sense in your mind, but in your heart and in your gut, you're going to feel, you're going to know in your heart and in your gut that something is awry, something is amiss. Roy says, labor omnia vincit, or labor omnia vincit improbus, is a Latin phrase meaning work conquers all. You have to do the work, and this is the work that we're going through step by step here. So the next step, and this is one which doesn't happen in the mind, it happens in the consciousness, is synthesis. The comprehension, knowing how egos harm us and others. This is insight. This is not theory, it's not belief. Again, it's not in the mind. It's a flash of insight which comes to us, usually in meditation, usually as we are meditating on particular egos. And coming back to the previous step and how these two work together, steps 3 and 4, as we are in, for example, meditation, and we're using visualization and retrospection in meditation, we can play out the scenarios in our mind, in our mind's eye, let us say. And we are just playing them out as we remember them and as best we can objectively to our experience of them. And without indulging the egos, we don't want to get really emotional again and feel the rage and feel the fear or feel whatever in that same way. Because again, we don't want to embrace, we don't want to indulge the egos. What we want to do is accept them and analyze them, be aware of them. So how do you analyze? To analyze with the consciousness means to just simply observe and penetrate with the consciousness, with concentration, but not intellectual analysis. You simply shine the light of consciousness on the ego, on the experience. And given enough time and given enough focused concentration and relaxation and visualization and retrospection, all that, you will receive that insight, that comprehension will come, and it'll be like a flash of knowing, and it'll be like this eureka moment, and you will just know. Now you'll just know, and you're like, oh, so that's what's been happening. That's what's been going on. That's what caused me to blow my top, or that's what caused me to react the way I did and how I did and why I did. And it'll just all be there. Just come to you. That's synthesis. And that's synthesis in the consciousness. And that happens in meditation. But if you want it to happen, if you expect it to happen, if you're impatient and thinking to yourself, why isn't it happening? Why isn't it happening? Why isn't it happening? It's never going to happen. A few live streams back, we did a live stream on waiting in the dark. And it was all about patience. Steps 3 and 4 in the analogous ultimate methodology, analysis and synthesis, they are all about patience. This is where the virtue of patience matters most. To wait, simply wait for that synthesis to happen organically in the consciousness. It doesn't happen mechanically, and you can't force it to happen. You can't make it happen. You can't speed up the process, no matter how desperately you want it to go faster. And remember that sometimes we have to meditate on these things and for years before we finally comprehend them. And so we have to go through countless multiple exercises, experiences, tests, trials, and ordeals before we finally begin to get at the heart and synthesize that comprehension of whatever it is in our subconsciousness that's causing us that suffering, especially if we're dealing with stronger entities like a demon, for example. If we're living with such a thing, we know what we're speaking with because that's what we live with. The next step, is catharsis. The elimination of the comprehended egos. When the lesson is learned, an ego's purpose is served. So our Divine Mother is the one who can eliminate our egos, but she can only eliminate those egos which we have previously comprehended, because the egos are there to teach us something. The egos exist because of the mistakes that we made. And so the ego's presence in our life, they're causing suffering for us, are what we need in order to learn our lesson, to comprehend the consequences of our actions, and to comprehend the causes of our continued defects, our continued errors and mistakes, our continued causing of suffering for others, for instance. But once we've synthesized and comprehended an ego, our Divine Mother can eliminate that ego, and we achieve a profound sense of catharsis that follows comprehension. That's through the work with our Divine Mother and through the work of the sexual fire, which is, again, both a creative force and a destructive force. And it has the power to destroy egos. But only the Divine Mother has that power. We're going to just pause and take a few comments here. Thank you. This really helps, as most of us at some stage struggle with these individually, and especially in relationship to others. The mirror effect is a great way to recognize where we must do the work in ourselves. Absolutely. Melissa, absolutely. We have an entire article called Lovers and Chi Eaters that describes that dynamic, especially in romantic relationships, because it's the more emotion there is behind a relationship, the more intense the psychological work and the intense the mirroring is. For instance, you may have noticed in your own life that there is no one on the planet that drives you more insane than your family. Perhaps one particular member, perhaps one or more members of your family. And rest assured, there's no one on the planet that drives them more insane than you. And that's because you are all essentially sharing much of the same DNA, along with much of the same egos, much of the same energy. And so naturally, those vibrations are going to be triggering one another. Plus, on top of it, there's really nobody in the world you care more for than your family, and there's nobody in the world that your family cares more for than you. So that caring, that intense desire to see what's best for you, it injects this intensity of energy where there's this expression that says your friends are God's way of making amends for your family. And then, of course, the only other individual that you would ever argue with or fight with in even remotely an intense a way is your lover. And for obvious reasons, right? Because there's that emotional attachments and connections and that same intensity of fire. Rich threw in the word here, diffusion. And Ghazali Ahmad has a long comment here we'll get through. I want to quickly say a big thank you to Dr. Aduaga for what he has done for me. I have been suffering from genital herpes for the last 18 months. I saw a lady's comment. Okay, this just sounds like it's a advertisement. Okay, so we'll continue. What follows catharsis is liberation, obviously. Our best self is freed from the harm and negative influence of those eliminated egos. This is important because it's not enough to say, well, we just eliminate egos. What the ego was holding on to, what the ego had enslaved, that small fraction of consciousness that was empowering that ego, is now liberated. So not only is our best self freed from the ego, the consciousness is liberated from that ego. And again, we'll come back to this notion of self and shadow self and archetype and negative archetype. The last step, the final step of the process, is self-knowledge. Strength, resilience, growth, wisdom, self-actualization, gnosis of our best self. We become more aware of our true self, of our best self, when we have eliminated the obscurations to that. We were speaking recently about consciousness as bandwidth and how we have a limited amount of bandwidth connecting us to our higher self, our true self. And that bandwidth is consciousness, how conscious we are. And if you think about your consciousness like your internet connection, and think about what happens when you start downloading music, you're downloading a video game, you're streaming a movie, and you're on a Zoom call, and you're doing Facebook, and you're doing any number of things, and then somebody upstairs starts downloading a movie, and other people in the house are downloading things. What happens to your internet connection? So the process of elimination of egos, of quieting the mind, and of gaining mastery, gaining control back over the use of your consciousness, of liberating the consciousness from all of these miscellaneous functions and activities happening in the background or in the subconscious mind, you are now increasing your bandwidth. And the more bandwidth you have, the more clear and the faster you can receive those downloads, because you've freed up bandwidth. So these are the 7 steps of the Alm of Life. Now, this is also a circle. We do this over and over and over and over and over again. Shadow work is not something you do on a weekend. It's not something that you start doing and then stop doing. It's not something where you go, okay, I'm going away on retreat, and I'm going to go on retreat into the mountains or into the rainforest or wherever. I'm going to go into this lovely new age resort, and I'm going to do shadow work there for a week. Then I'm going to come back and I will have done my shadow work. This is an ongoing continuum. And when we look at the nature of this continuum, we realize that it's of a spiral nature, like the hero's journey. We don't do the hero's journey once. We start one place, and every time we go around the hero's journey, we gain a little bit more consciousness, we gain a little bit more wisdom, we gain a little bit more self-knowledge. And if you look at it from a certain perspective, you cut off the sides, the spiral looks an awful lot like a ladder. For example, Dante's ladder or Jacob's ladder. And each revolution, we go down and then we come up. We descend and then we ascend. And this down and up and down and up, we descend into hell. We have to go down into hell for our analysis and our synthesis. That's where step 4 is. 1, 2, 3, 4. The synthesis, the analysis, synthesis, and catharsis are down here in hell, in our subconscious mind, in the darkness. We have to bring the light of consciousness. We have to bring the light of mindfulness, diagnosis, analysis down into the depths. This is what is allegorized in Dungeons and Dragons and every role-playing game, where the hero goes deeper and deeper and deeper into the dungeons, and he vanquishes the monsters there. And what does he gain? He gains experience points. And the more experience points he gets, eventually he can get to new levels. He can level up. And what do we call gnosis? We call gnosis self-evident experiential knowledge, that which we seek. And every spiritual aspirant is a seeker. This is Perseus, who descends into, we always get the two confused. It's either Perseus or Theseus. Perseus goes after Medusa, and Theseus goes after the Minotaur. So if we have that right, Theseus descends into the labyrinth to confront the Minotaur. And again, the Minotaur is the anima animus, right? It's the animal self that's lurking in the labyrinth. But Theseus has to descend into the labyrinth. He has to seek, he has to find that Minotaur. Shadow work is a commitment to bettering ourselves, Melissa. It is a commitment to that. And it is something that happens on an ongoing basis. It's a commitment to ourself. It's not a commitment so much to bettering ourselves. It is a commitment to bringing our true self into the world by eliminating the obscurations to our true self, by eliminating that which blocks and prevents us being our best self, our true self. And we're going to touch on that a little bit more in a minute. So again, the alm of life, right? The true shadow work, real shadow work, is an ongoing cycle, an ongoing process of observing ourselves, remembering ourselves, identifying, diagnosing egos, analyzing them in meditation or journaling or visualization, retrospection, contemplation, introspection, synthesizing self-evident experiential knowledge, right? Comprehending those egos, eliminating and liberating the consciousness, and gaining self-knowledge, and getting further along the path of self-actualization, self-realization. This shape, the spiral, is everywhere in nature, from the Nautilus to the hurricane to galaxies. This shape, this universal archetypal process, this ultimate methodology. And we spoke recently, last Wednesday, in fact, when we were speaking about the baffling, life is baffling. We were talking about living water and how baffles cause water to swirl around and create these spiral patterns and these spiral flow forms. And that's what creates energized living water. Again, this is all related. Yeah, and both Rich and Proteus say the golden ratio, and that's related. But what is also related is that if you look at spirals and if you study Walter Russell's 4D vortex science, what you're looking at here is the 4D hypercube. And if you meditate on this visualization, you will notice that every movement of every point in this visualization is a spiral. And if you read Walter Russell's A New Concept of the Universe, you will read how the whole of the fourth dimension is based on spiral vortex science, spiral vortex movement. In other words, the alm of life. And the fourth dimension happens to be the ninth sphere, which is the Divine Mother, which is completely absent from any discussion of shadow work in the Jungian pantheon, in the Jungian explanation. Nobody mentions the divine fire working with Kundalini, working with the sexual force. Well, let's step back for just one moment here. Serena says, would you count as valid synthesis catharsis the approach of checking in with the morphic field to identify inherited or learned disorderly patterns? None of that matters. That only affects your mechanical machine. So if we understand the question, and we're not 100% sure we do, but it's better if you use an example than speak in abstract terms like this. But if we understand what you're saying, it would be like, for example, you went to a rock concert and there was a riot that took place, and you found yourself getting caught up in the morphic resonance field of the rioters, and you found yourself behaving in ways that you would never behave under normal circumstances. So a good example of that is a few years ago in Vancouver, the Vancouver Canucks won the Stanley Cup, and the home team won in Vancouver, and the home crowd were so excited, so overwhelmed with emotion that they burst out of the arena into downtown Vancouver, and they began rioting. They began rioting and looting, and they were overturning police cars and smashing windows. And the tickets for the Stanley Cup the Stanley Cup finals, a ticket was well over $200 or $300. So many, and some people paid well over $1,000 to be there, which means that these people were not what you might call, lower class or simple-minded people, or any, like, you could not use that excuse. These were like well-to-do, a lot of them white-collar workers, very well off, but this is behavior that they would never normally do under normal circumstances. These are people who never even shoplifted anything in their life. We're now rioting and looting the downtown streets of Vancouver, smashing windows and looting stores because they were caught in that morphic resonance field. However, if we're understanding your question, Serena, if they were to meditate and say, oh, well, you know what? I only behaved that way because I was getting caught up in the crowd, and so that's what caused it. That's even if they were to come to that conclusion, they would miss the point. Anyway, you followed up with an example, so let's read your example and see what you're coming to here. An example I had in mind was in the work of family constellations, connecting with the field of a family or organization to check which are the patterns which are out of order and therefore controlling from shadow subconscious programming, or things like parts work, a person-owned energy field of different parts, person-owned energy field of different parts. Okay. Try to appreciate that energy, okay, cannot influence or affect you directly. It can only affect your human machine, your vessel, if it first triggers and stimulates the mechanical elements inside of that vessel. So if you're talking about any type of morphic resonance or family connections or anything else related to that, all of that energy, all those vibrations, all the rays in which that you may be associated with, they do have an influence. And if you're talking about the rays that have an influence on your being, you're not meditating on your being in this case, you're meditating on your egos. So if you're talking about any negative energies or influences that can influence you in a negative way, you can't alter those rays. You can't alter those family connections. You can't alter those family constellations. You can't change that. Nothing you do will ever change that. That is what it is. But coming to that realization or comprehension doesn't help you, because it's going to make you say, oh, well, that's that influence and I can't change that, so I will not even going to bother. But you can change it. But how do you change it? You eliminate the ego, which is feeding on that energy, which is strengthened and stimulated by that energy, by those rays. And you liberate yourself from those elements inside of you, which you have inherited. Oh, yeah, or possibly, Rich, you could say you resent it. That is possible, which is, again, another trick of the ego. And that's also not going to help you. But it also doesn't help to simply, you cannot, this process, the analogous ultimate methodology, quote, shadow work. If even in your mind, even the question that pops up and thinking, okay, well, I'm suffering in this way. I'm going to focus my meditations on these external influences. Already, you're thinking in the wrong way. Already, your ego mind is pulling you away from the work. Because you cannot blame anyone or anything for your behavior. Period. If you do so, you are not practicing the Alm of Life. You are not doing any sort of shadow work. It's a cop-out. You're finding rationalizations, excuses, and justifications for why you cannot change. And this is false. This is wrong. This is antithetical to the path. The one aspect of what Jung says about you must make the unconscious conscious, you must become aware of it, and you must accept it. You must accept that, yes, there's something inside of me that reacts a certain way to these energies. And every time I'm exposed to those energies, this thing inside me, this ego, this demon, this entity, whatever it may be, is reacting to these energies, is being triggered by these energies, and it's causing me, my mind, my heart, and my motor, instinctive sexual centers to react and to act in ways that I don't like, to act in ways that's causing me and others suffering. But the key is not to try to control or alter or change all the circumstances. That's the mistake that yogis make, those ascetic yogis make that go up into the mountain. We need the outside influences to trigger us. We need those energies and whatever to come in and influence us. But what we need more is to observe and diagnose and analyze and comprehend the egos inside of us, which are feeding on that energy and which are reacting to and which are triggered by that energy. Because if we can eliminate those egos from us, then those rays, those energies, those influences won't affect us in that way anymore. That's how this works. It always comes back here. You need look no further than within yourself. And so the next question here is, how does one go about the tendency to a lack of reaction? Well, if you truly have no reaction, then you are a resurrected ascended master and you don't need to be here. But our guess is that's not true. That's not a true statement. And that you don't need to worry about a lack of reaction. If you have no reaction, then you have no ego and you're an ascended master and you don't need to be here. But we're telling you 100% that that's not true. That can't possibly be true. Because you wouldn't be asking us this question if it were. So if what you're talking about is apathy, or what you're talking about is a tendency to have, what's the word we're looking for? Oh, it's on the tip of our tongue. When you just simply don't care, you don't care about anyone or anything, right? So then you have to look in yourself and ask why. That means possibly you only care about yourself and you don't react to anyone or anything. Thank you, Proteus. Indifference. If you're feeling indifferent to everyone and everything, then you have to look in yourself and say why that is. reactions are not a good thing. They're ego reactions. But the other thing, of course, is that you might just be an introvert. Yes, not reacting when one could do something in the sense of doing. Again, you know what would be helpful, Serena, is a concrete example, a case study, because in the abstract here, there's a million possible ways that we can imagine what you're talking about here. So there's a million possible reasons why you would not react. You could be not reacting out of fear. You could be not reacting because you're an introvert. It's not in your nature to react overtly and outwardly. It's in your nature to swallow all your actions and direct them all internally and internalize everything. In which case, you just might not be aware on the surface, unconsciously, consciously what's going on, but unconsciously and subconsciously, you are reacting, but you're swallowing that reaction, as an introvert does, as a shy person does, not externally expressing it as an extrovert would. But that requires you to know yourself. That requires meditating on yourself and knowing yourself. And if that's the case, then you have a lot of work to do, and you have to very carefully observe yourself and very carefully learn all of the different subtle nuances and the subtle hints. Because if your ego reactions don't register at all, and then you don't know, then you really don't know what's going on. You have to start peeling back those layers within yourself and really focus and study yourself, because you will always be able to find signs of reaction. There's always going to be something bubbling up to the surface, and they might be very subtle cues, but you can start picking up on them. It's the same way that someone who suffers from Asperger's syndrome learns how to read faces and starts reading subtle cues, because they can't sense anything, they can't feel, they can't get a read on people. So it's like they have blinders on. So what they have to do is they have to learn a different methodology to sense people's emotional state. You might have to do that same process on yourself. But again, it all comes down to this process: mindfulness and self-knowledge. This is the goal. Like, self-knowledge is the goal. Knowing yourself. We hope that answers the question. If not, feel free to give us an example or ask us after the fact another time, like ask us in a private chat, and we can address this further. Rich says, thought paralysis caused by two equally passionate opposites. Yeah, we're not talking about any sort of mental gymnastics here. So that can happen on the mental plane. As you say, you have two competing. This is what, well, we did an entire lecture on this a week ago, when we talked about the paradoxes, spiritual paradoxes that appear to be paradoxes in the mind, and the mind has equally passionate opposites, because there really is no paradox. There's only a paradox to the mind, and the passionate opposites are just a passion for the truth, for the process, for the nature of things. There is no paradox, but to the mind there's a paradox, and that's what causes it to fritz out. Rich again says, feeling strongly about polarizing responses could cause one to not do anything. It's possible. It's possible that would cause indifference or cause lack of, but we're not. Remember, there's a difference between reaction and response, right? Egos react, the consciousness, the being, responds. As you do your self-observation, as you do your mindfulness practice, this is part of the work, to learn the discernment between a reaction and a response. Now, a reaction is automatic, mechanical. It is a stimulus reaction. It is almost immediate, or very often immediate, like a knee-jerk reaction, like a reflex action. Response, if we can learn to take a breath, pause, responses usually come after that breath, after that pause. We receive insight on what to do. Although, not necessarily, because if what's required is immediate response, then sometimes we get an immediate response. But to know the difference between that and a reaction, that only happens through self-observation. And again, as we've discussed in the past, learning the flavor between intuition and commands that we receive from our innermost, our self, versus the reactions of ego. This is all, if you practice the Alm of Life, that's the other benefit of doing mindfulness and diagnosis and analysis this way. Because you're doing all of this from the perspective of your innermost being. And that's why self-remembering has to be a part of this process, and remembering your Divine Mother, because as you work through this process, as you observe yourself and your reactions and responses, you start to develop the discernment between the self and this so-called shadow self. And again, we have a ways to go yet. So let's continue here. Okay. So we've done our comprehensions. We've done our mindfulness, our diagnosis, analysis, synthesis, and now it's time for that catharsis and liberation step. And we said that we work with the Divine Mother for that. Now, most egos, we can just do pranayama, we can work with the sexual fire as a single person. But some egos that we face are too powerful or too strong to eliminate with just as a single person, which brings us to working with the force, the sexual force. And again, the creative force in the ninth sphere, we're gonna hear some more Star Wars terminology, but it's not that important. We work in the ninth sphere, the nine-sided cubic stone, or the philosophical stone. That's the stone of alchemy, which transforms the lead of ego into the gold of the human soul. It's a nine-sided stone. And interestingly enough, if you take a Jedi holocron and a Sith holocron and you combine them, the holocrons contain the most closely guarded secrets of the Jedi Order. It's fascinating because if you take a Jedi holocron and a Sith holocron, you put them together, what do you get? A nine-sided cubic stone, the philosophical stone. The most closely guarded secrets of the Jedi. And that's the Holy Grail. It is the secret of secrets. It's the secret doctrine of the ages. It is the great arcanum of sexual alchemy, of working with the fires and waters of sex, and raising the Kundalini and awakening, illuminating all of the chakras, and illuminating the spinal column. Why? So that the fires of Kundalini unite with the fires of the Holy Spirit, And this is where someone, Proteus, earlier said Binah. And this is symbolized and allegorized in the Pentecostal fires atop of the apostles' heads. This is also why all the saints and the Buddhas and the masters and the avatars and the angels all have halos, because the illuminating fires have risen into the crown chakra and have illuminated the third eye. Again, so there's the angels, the Buddhas. So in other words, the final film in the sequel trilogy, The Rise of Skywalker, we are literally raising the Christic force, the Christic fires, from their existence in the living force in the ninth sphere, in the fourth dimension. We are raising them back to their origin from the cosmic force, the cosmic Christ. In another way to express it, we've expressed it this way countless times, the Divine Mother Kundalini, her fires raised up the spinal column, unite with the fires of the Holy Spirit, so that the fires of the divine feminine unite with the fires of the divine masculine, and give rise to the fire of the fires and the light of lights of the cosmic Christ, the cosmic force. And we'll have another indication of that soon. So this is symbolized by Rey's yellow lightsaber at the end of The Rise of Skywalker. A little bit more symbolism here, connecting Star Wars and The Rise of Skywalker to, in this case, Excalibur and these sacred symbols. Here we have the blade and the chalice, and the union of the blade and chalice to begin to create the X as an Excalibur. And in the Rise of Skywalker, we have Exegol. And X is a cross. The cross is the masculine, the phallus, positive action, holy affirmation, and the negative, the feminine, uterus, negative, passion, holy negation. And the union, or sex, neutral, creation, holy reconciliation. It is the I and the O, the EO, which can be represented this way as the dot and the circumference, the center and the circumference. That's the alpha and the omega. But of course, the problem is that they're separate. The origin and the circumference are separate. So alpha and omega have to connect. So what do? We put a twist in omega. And now the circumference passes through the origin. This is the Holy Eight, also the sign of infinity. And there's also the origin of the wedding bands. And you see the relationships between the masculine and feminine and union of masculine and feminine. This is positive infinity, negative infinity, passing through the origin, the 0 point, the absolute. So more law of three, we have again the Tao, we have the caduceus of Mercury, and then the serpent and the staff, the raising of the Kundalini on the staff. Here we have Moses, who raises the serpent on a staff of bronze. Bronze is an alchemical union of copper, which is feminine, and tin, which is masculine. And that's why we have a serpent of bronze. All right. So because we're heading up on Christmas, and we were talking about raising the Kundalini and raising the Christ, but we also talked about the giving birth to the Christ. Well, it just so happens that an illuminated tree of life with the rising lights, the rising Christ, that's the Christmas tree. The balls on the Christmas tree, right? The baubles, Christmas tree ornaments, they are the sephira on the tree of life. And the garland is the tzik, the ray of creation, either descending or ascending, doesn't really matter. But it's the same, it has the same orientation around the tree. And at the bottom, we have the base of the tree. We have what the tree stands in is the ninth sphere. And we have the three wise men who bring their gifts to the bottom of the tree. And why are the three? Because the gifts are of the mind, the heart, and the body. The mind, the heart, and the motor instinctive sexual center. So mind, heart, body, those are the gifts that wise men bring to the tree, to the base of the tree, to the ninth sphere. So again, remember when we were showing the human machine and upright nines in each of the three brains and five centers. And the gifts are myrrh, gold, and frankincense. That's from the biblical tradition. And again, here we have the mind, heart, and body. And we have the star on top of the tree, which is the upright pentagram. So that allows us, the alm of life, that process, that methodology, and working with the sexual fire in the upright positive way is how we can eliminate the causes of our shadow self, what creates the shadow self, and return, give rise to the golden bodies, the human soul, and raise the Christic fire from the ninth sphere back up to the absolute and illuminating our tree of life. That's basically, because at the end of the day, I mean, hopefully we don't have to spell this out, but Christmas celebrates the birth of Christ. Oh, sorry, we were. Okay, there's a few comments we missed here. We're going to go back and try to answer them. Well, we'll just put on a. Okay. All right. Understanding Holy Spirit. We're not sure what you were making that comment in reference to. Rich says unified electromagnetic energy fields. Roy mentioned Sophia is a Greek word that means wisdom. Yes, Sophia does mean wisdom. And Sophia also refers to our divine feminine. That the psyche and the divine feminine are Sophia. So the Pista Sophia is all about the descent into the ninth sphere and the return of Sophia from the ninth sphere. So that's the creation of Christ. So the realization, self-realization of Christ after it is descended and ascended. Philosophy is the love of wisdom, Rich says. Rich also mentions there the caduceus, which is also the staff of Hermes. It's also known as the staff of Hermes. The caduceus of Mercury or the staff of Hermes. Nick asked, what exactly does Baphomet represent? Baphomet is a spirit between man and nature, and it is no, sorry, that's wrong. The demiurge is a spirit between man and nature. Baphomet represents the choice, our free will, to solve et coagula, which is to dissolve the ego or to further coagulate as ego. So Baphomet is the choice, the free will, to ascend or descend on the tree of life, to take the upward spiral of the alm of life or the downward spiral, the right hand path or the left hand path. That's what Baphomet represents. Baphomet is many people believe he is the devil or Satan, but he's really just, you could say he's the tempting Eve, or this tempting serpent, because he's, what Baphomet is offering us a choice. So in that sense, he could be Satan from Faust, where Satan appears to Faust and offers Faust great success and whatnot. But Faust has to sell his soul to the devil. Okay. Roy mentioned the middle path. Nick followed this up by saying, since Staff of Hermes is on Baphomet, but sometimes pentagram is up, sometimes down, most people associate it with Satan, but I think it represents that force and how we use it. Yeah, so correct. But then that's the choice, right? And if you use that sexual force to create more density, then that's coagula, to coagulate. That's to become more and more dense, heavier, and more material, more physical, more oriented and attached and identified with material mechanical nature. But that's further into hell, right? The density of that. Or that's the 6. Or you can use the energy in an upright way as a 9. And then you dissolve all the matter, all that solidity, all that heaviness. So that's why the words that are tattooed on Baphomet's arms are solve et coagula. Coagula means to coagulate, to become more dense, and solve means to dissolve. But it's also solution. And to be in solution means to have dissolved, right? You take something, and we talk about a solution, a saline solution or a sugar solution. You take a sugar cube and you drop it in water and you dissolve it, or you take salt and you dissolve it in water and you create a brine. You call that a saline solution. The salt is now in solution. It's now one with the water. Dylan says, this might seem like an initiate level question, but from which way does the fire rise? The spiral into the chakras, from the left, right, or is it just center? The chakras spin from right to left. From right to left or left to right? Oh, it's from right to left. So the chakras themselves spin from right to left. The fire, it will spiral. Does it really matter? No one's ever asked us this question. So does it really matter? If it matters to you, I suppose you can meditate on it. You can find an answer for yourself. We've never concerned ourselves with how the Kundalini rises, because it rises up the spinal medulla of the Shushumna canal, and how she chooses to rise will be related to Well, it could be. We can't give you an answer until we meditate on it. We can't give you an answer. To do as thou wilt. Yes, that would be Baphomet. Roy shared a post with Nick, Facebook post, which we won't be pulling up. And Rich, this is so informative. Thank you. You're welcome. Okay, so we're caught up on comments. All right. Let's. We have a few more slides, and then we can take some more questions at the end. So, after all we've been through, going through the Alm of Life and going through what we've been showing on the Tree of Life and the Kundalini, let's return to our illustrious Carl Jung and the archetypes and the shadows and the shadow work. We're going to make this big again. Can we make it even bigger? We can make it even bigger. Okay. So here we see the villain. And now we know that we have to eliminate the egos and raise the Kundalini, give rise to the Christ, so that we can awaken and truly embody the hero. This is what mastery is. From the point of view of the White Lodge, from the point of view of spiritual advancement. There is no, if there is no integration of the villain, there's no identification, there's no attachment to the villain. We may have to accept ourselves as the villain. We may have to accept our inner villain, that we have that capacity, that we have that potential. And that villain is always lurking in the shadows from the standpoint of, if we have egos, so long as we have egos, there's always egos that are trying to get us to fall. And then, of course, there's what Gurdjieff talked about, the Hasnamusen, which is the split center of gravity, where we talk about mastery, someone who's becoming a hero and a master simultaneously. They're feeding both those archetypes. And this is the real danger of understanding the shadow work as integration of the shadow and embracing your shadow, because that's what's going to happen. You're going to end up as a Hasnamusen, one with a dual center of gravity, a split center of gravity. And here's the catch, right? There is no shadow self. It's your false self and your true self. There is no shadow self. It's just you. This whole idea that there is a villain lurking in the shadows is just an abstract concept. What there are egos lurking in the shadows, lurking in the subconscious, in the subconscious mind. And if you're not careful, you will fall prey and become a villain instead of being the hero. That's right. This idea that you are a hero and a villain, and that you have to comprehend the fact that you are both, and you have to embrace the fact that you are both, and that completely ignores what actually creates a hero and a villain, which are the egos. and trying to feed both, trying to embrace both your villainous side and your heroic side, you're gonna create a Hasnamussen, because you're going to be using that sexual force sometimes upright and as a 6, or sorry, as a 9, and sometimes inverted as a 6. Coming to Baphomet, sometimes you're going to be solving, sometimes you're going to be coagulating. So I feel like it rises by way of the autonomic nervous system, in virtue of which you are resting your attention in each energy center as follows, root to crown. That's No, it doesn't. No. The Kundalini doesn't go through the nervous system. No, it only goes through the nervous system if you orgasm. And then it short circuits the nervous system. When you're raising the Kundalini, it goes through the Shushumna canal of the spine. It has nothing to do with the nervous system. And yes, we're talking about white tantra. Either you're doing pranayama and the Vairoli mudra as a single person, white tantra as a married person with your spouse. Yes, if referring to sexual transmutation, yes, okay. The villain side can serve us? No, it can't. This is exactly what we've been saying the whole time. What we're trying to get at the whole time is, how does the villain serve you? The villain serves you only as a warning. If you embrace the villain, if you indulge your inner villain, it's not going to serve you. It's going to serve itself, because the inner villain is an illusion. These archetypes, this whole system that Jung created here, it's vaguely helpful to understand kind of your personality, or your modality, possibly as your innermost being, what archetypes you relate to. But this idea of these shadows and this shadow self being a necessary aspect of these archetypes, it's simply the opposite of the archetype. What happens if you're not following your innermost being, but you're hypnotized and indulging your egos? Well, then you're not going to be a hero, you're going to be a villain. So this focus on these negative, these shadow archetypes themselves, is a completely erroneous, unnecessary, and in our view, wasteful activity. Because we know people, for example, who self-identify as the trickster, right? They self-identify as the trickster, that they've embraced that's what they are. They're this trickster. Oh, and they're doing this trick. And we know these individuals, we know that self-identification as the trickster is what holds them back from their spiritual advancement. They become identified and attached to these. It's the same way like fans who identify with Darth Vader and the Sith. There are many fans of Star Wars who identify with the Sith. It's holding them back. Proteus says, Thaumael, master of darkness, crowd of gods. We have no idea what you're referring to there, actually. Okay, again, what happens to villains? Reincarnate into a lower world? If someone embraces their egos and indulges their egos and chooses the left-hand path, they will go into hell and they will become a minion of hell. And they can return, they can reincarnate, or they can possess We're not experts in all the many ways of the left-hand path and the Black Lodge. That's not what this live stream is for. And that's not this. If you're looking for information on the Black Lodge and its ways, you'll need to find that in another resource, because that's not what we're experts in. We're experts in how the Black Lodge possess. We're experts in how the Black Lodge cause suffering. We're experts in how the Black Lodge are here to oppose and test and be our adversary. But on all the intricate details of how they do and what they do and all their ways and stuff like that, you'll have to seek that someplace else if that's what you're interested in. Okay. So let's see if after all this, we can look at some other things that Jung said and put it into context. Let's see if we can discern the intuition that was at work behind Jung's work. Because the fellow's life's work is a monumental work. Okay, thanks for explaining that, Proteus. So the Qlipoth of the Tree of Life, Thamiel, is the shadow of Keter. Okay. No, fair enough. And you said he was... okay. All right, so Jung said, for example, a man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them. As far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. All of a sudden, Jung has a comment here that 100% expresses the Aum of life, the Aum of psychology. That we have to pass through the inferno of our passions. And what is a passion? That which we're willing to suffer for. So in other words, we have to pass through the inferno of suffering in order to overcome them. And that the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness and everything that irritates us about others can lead to an understanding of ourselves because of that mirroring that we were talking about. So here, in light of the Aum of life, the analogous ultimate methodology, in light of that, we have Jung making a statement which seems completely 100% aligned with everything that we were mentioning. Your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. So this we were referring earlier, we were talking about one of the comments was asking about other forces and energies, and it was Serena. Serena asked about family constellations and outside energies and so on. And here, Jung agrees with us. Your visions will only become clear when you look into your own heart. If you look outside, you dream. And if you look inside, you awake. So if you're looking outside of yourself, whatever that outside is, whatever those outside influences are, you're going to remain sleeping and you're going to remain dreaming. You look inside to the causes of your suffering and to the causes of your behaviors. And it is through that process of introspection, the Om of life, the analogous ultimate methodology, self-observation, self-remembering, diagnosis and analysis, etc., everything that we've talked about, and working with your own individual divine mother. And everything around you is a mirror. The circumstances, the people, everything around you is a mirror and an opportunity for you to see better into your own heart. Again, Jung, 100% in agreement with everything that we've shared tonight. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. You know that modern psychologists and sociologists are completely absorbed with trauma, and how people as child psychologists have completely raised 2 generations of bubble wrap children because everybody thinks that they're the product of their childhood. And here Carl Jung is telling us, basically, Carl Jung is serving as Baphomet, here and now. Solve et coagula. You choose. A circumstance is just a circumstance. You choose what you become as a result of walking through that inferno of fire, while going through hell. 2 people side by side go through exactly the same experience. Let's say in war, one becomes shell-shocked, the other becomes a hero. They go through exactly the same thing. So again, there's no discrepancy here between what Jung is saying in these statements and the analogous ultimate methodology, that which we were walking you through, the real shadow work. The real shadow work. Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people. Again, self-knowledge leads to wisdom, leads to objective knowledge. And it also leads to compassion. Because when you know the causes of your suffering, when you encounter others and you encounter the causes of their suffering, you are more likely to show compassion to them because you know what they're going through, because you've gone through it yourself. And you have made it conscious. You are aware of all that. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Which is, if you see yourself as the villain now, but in your heart of hearts, you know that you are a hero in the making, then the privilege of a lifetime is to work, to use the analogous ultimate methodology, to eliminate the egos and redeem yourself, to transform yourself, to transmute yourself, to transmute the lead of ego into the gold of the human soul, to transmute the lead of the villain into the gold of the hero, to redeem Darth Vader back into Anakin Skywalker. Even a happy life cannot be without a measure of darkness. And the word happy would lose its meaning if it were not balanced by sadness. This is obviously relates to the fact that we have egos that are there to teach us lessons. And we have to be aware of our defects and vices. And those tests, trials, and ordeals are difficult. And there can be no joy without, there can be no happiness without darkness. There can be no light without darkness. So we have to accept and we have to be aware of the darkness inside of us in order that we keep striving toward the light. And more importantly, we have to learn that allowing and accepting is not indulging, it's not embracing, it's simply allowing and accepting. It's not identification and it's not attachment, but it's recognizing that we are what we are and circumstances are what they are. And until we can rectify them, we do have to learn to live with them. And that creates greater impetus for us to do the work, and it creates greater reward for when we are successful at it. Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent. Here he's referring to two things. One is the self-actualization or lack thereof of the parent. So a parent who is not living in accordance with the will of their being, they're not truly living if they're just going through the motions. And the second thing is this whole thing about bubble wrap children. You know, these parents who are afraid of everything, they have so much fear, they're terrified of going out and having real experiences and living life to its fullest. They create this sanitized environment for the children to grow up in, and thus those children are wholly unprepared for the world. And we see that in the snowflake generation. We see that in these children which expect everything. They have all these entitlements. They've never suffered, they've never been told they're wrong, they've never gone through, so these parents who have, and in that sense, these parents who have not allowed themselves to get angry, or not allowed them, not shown any severity with their children, have not disciplined their children, have not really lived the life of a proper parent, their children are damaged, they're unprepared, they're underdeveloped, they're developmentally retarded, developmentally, emotionally, intellectually, constitutionally, right? They have no constitution. They have no endurance, mental and emotional endurance for the life which awaits them as an adult. And that is because their parents failed to live properly. So they have this unlived parental life, and also social life and everything else, so that a life unlived by the parent, because children learn by example. Children don't learn from what you tell them. Children learn from what they see, right? Monkey see, monkey do. Children look up to their parents, and they want to mimic. And that's why so many alcoholics, for instance, had alcoholic parents. And many of the behaviors and conditioned behaviors we inherited from our parents. So if the parent is not truly living a full life, then the child is going to be developmentally retarded, emotionally and mentally, and all the ways that we describe. We're going to take a comment really quick. Rich says, I am what I choose to become by creating my persona or my person by way of meditative creativity on a subconscious level. Or in other words, I become the story I tell myself. Psycho-cybernetic. However, in the substantial reality, the real reality, I am the awareness in the background. There is a lot happening in that comment, Rich, and there's a lot being confused and conflated. You are simultaneously, you are talking about um, creating persona or personality. You're talking about black magic. And you may say that in reality, you are the awareness in the background, but if you are actively seeking to create an alter ego or an alter personality, you're engaging in black magic. Because that is not what I am, what I choose to become means. That's not what Baphomet is talking about. And the spiritual path is not about creating the personality you want. That's the left-hand path. And the more you do that, the more you engage in that, the more you will become identified and attached and consumed by that. Because the only aspect of you that would desire that is your ego. So there is no path to your true self through what you call here as psycho-cybernetics. All right, let's go on to the next topic of Jung. We should not pretend to understand the world only by the intellect. We apprehend it just as much by feeling. Therefore, the judgment of the intellect is, at best, only the half of truth, and must, if it be honest, also come to an understanding of its inadequacy. How often have we said, right, not to trust your ego mind? The ego mind is the adversary. How much have you heard us talk about anti-intellectualism and not relying on the ego and here he says, therefore, the judgment of the intellect is at best only half of the truth. You see, you see Jung kind of struggling with this intuitive knowing that we should not pretend to understand the world only by the intellect. Listen to very carefully to the words that he's using here. We should not pretend to understand only by the intellect, and that we apprehend just as much by feeling. But he's still locked into his intellectual conditioning. So he says, so, at best, the intellect is only half of the equation, half of the truth. And it must, if be honest, also come to an understanding of its inadequacy. So that if the intellect is to be honest with himself, to be honest with itself, it has to come to an understanding of its inadequacy. So that we must turn to other faculties. And he said feeling, and by feeling is much more than obviously emotions, right? We have senses. We have the sixth sense. We sense, we feel vibrations, for example, and we feel, but you can tell here he's like a cat scratching at the door of gnosis. He's like a cat scratching at the door of intuition, of the insight received from the higher self, and he really wants to get there, but because of his conditioning and probably the nature of his books and the nature of psychology that he finds himself working within the confines of, he can't go there. He can't go there, at least not officially, not in ways that are one day going to be quoted by someone off, in some place. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. We mentioned this earlier. Several different comments also talked about relationships, and we mentioned our blog article called "Lovers and She Eaters," and we also mentioned how the individuals we meet serve as mirrors to us. But note We were not talking about personalities. So Jung is locked into his Jungian archetypes and the archetypes of the persona, and he's locked into this modality of thinking. But what reacts, the chemical reaction between two personalities, is an energetic reaction. It's a vibrational reaction, which means the energy is being vibrated a certain way at a certain frequency by a certain ego. It's going to trigger the same ego that vibrates at the same frequency. It's called entrainment. It's called harmonization. It's called synchronicity. And are they both transformed? They're both transformed in the sense that they are both affected. They are temporarily transformed, but not permanently. Not permanently, or at least not in the ways that matter. Two people with the same ego encounter one another and have a chemical reaction, and they trigger one another. Yeah, they're both triggered, and they both might fly into a foaming frenzy and argue and fight and who knows, right? And they might, from that point forward, hate one another for all time, in which case you could say they're both transformed permanently because they both hate each other. But have either of them eliminated their ego because of that chemical reaction? No, because that chemical reaction is mechanical. And egos cannot be eliminated mechanically. They cannot. No mechanical process can eliminate an ego. Egos do not eliminate themselves because of circumstances. So again, he's trying to describe the actual metaphysical science of that chemical reaction between person, but it's not the personalities, again, because he's locked into this modern psychological framework of, well, it's the personalities that are reacting to each other. No, it's not. It's not. You have known many, many people with many, 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 many different personalities. And you've known people with very similar personalities to you and people with very different personalities to you. It's the egos that are reacting. Personalities are, obviously, some personalities may be more compatible with others than others, first, especially in terms of maybe friendships or relationships or whatever. But remember also that we're drawn to one another on a soul level, on the energetic level, the level of our being, our true self. Personality is to us like a character in a video game. So if you think of massively multiplayer online role-playing games, or you think of Dungeons and Dragons, you know that to form a party of characters, you need to have a tank, right? A big tough warrior. You need to have a magic user. You need to have a healer, and you need to have a thief, some kind of dexterous character who's very agile and nimble and can pick locks and open and disarm traps. And so, in other words, the different personalities, the different character archetypes, it's wise in your circle to have a spread of at least one of each type. So where personalities come into play, right? If you're forming a group of friends or friends, and very often you see this in movies or TV shows where the characters, they're friends, but they have very different personalities. And like there's, for example, you think of the sitcom Cheers, right? Where all of the characters on the show, they're all friends and they all work together, but they all have very different personalities. It's the same thing for MASH, same thing for many of these sitcoms and whatever. And but there's a great deal of chemistry there between those people, between those different characters. And you know in your own life that this is true. So compatibility is on a deeper level. It's on an energetic level, and it's on the level of egos, and it's also on the level of soul level, what we can learn from us, what we can learn from each other, what we can give to each other, teach from each other, teach each other, and get and learn from each other. And also how we mirror each other on that subconscious level, how our egos mirror one another, and how we often bicker and argue and fight, and how that brings those egos to the surface. So this is the difference between esoteric psychology, right, revolutionary psychology, the analogous ultimate methodology, and contemporary psychology, which is constantly focused on the surface, when the waves on the surface are really being moved by deep, deep, deep ocean currents. Well, we want to get to the deep, deep ocean currents, and then we can understand the surface a lot easier. Where love rules, there is no will to power. And where power predominates, love is lacking. The one is the shadow of the other. So we talked about at the beginning that we were going to unveil what this shadow work is, the fallacies of shadow work and the misconceptions about shadow work, and embracing your shadow and integrating your shadow. What we know now is what you are integrating is the consciousness that was previously bottled up in the egos, that was previously bottled up in the shadow, and empowering the shadow, right? Where love rules, there is no will to power. And what is this will to power? I am going to do this. I am going to do that. I want this. I want that. I am this. I am not that. They all love me. They all hate me. If I do this, they will love me. Right? All the stuff that we talked about, identification, rejection, craving, aversion, rationalization, and irrationality. All that will to power is known as ill will, the will of our egos. And Jung says right here in plain as day, where power predominates, love is lacking. The one is the shadow of the other. When we eliminate our egos, comprehend them, identify them, analyze them, comprehend them, and eliminate them with the help of our Divine Mother and the fires of Kundalini, the power that they had, we take back. But not as a will to power, but it returns as the force. Because when you look at Jedi and Sith, the difference between the Jedi and the Sith, they use the same force, but the Jedi use the light side of the force and the Sith use the dark side. And what is the dark side of the force? Fear, anger, aggression, yes. But power. Palpatine, Darth Sidious says, power, unlimited power. That's what the Sith are after. That's what the shadow is power, control. And when we can incinerate an ego, and what returns to us, the consciousness and the force that ego was using and consuming in order to gain power. That consciousness and that force returns to us. And when we say us, our being, our true self. There is only a true self and a false self. The I that has a will to power. In other words, there is only the self and the shadow. The true self and the false self. There is no I and a true self and a shadow. No, there isn't. This is what we made clear last Wednesday and again on Friday. We made it abundantly clear, and it was a revelation that came to us in that live stream when we were told to include these two images of a chessboard. And it's right down here. Upon awakening, you realize I am the adversary. I am the shadow. This idea that I'm going to go and do shadow work now on some imagined, abstract version of me that exists in the unconscious mind is no, I got to do this work on me, on myself. I am the shadow. While I'm asleep, I am the shadow. I am the shadow self. And doing shadow work means observing myself, remembering myself. The work to awaken the consciousness. The work to eliminate those elements that create this shadow self, which I am, until I awaken and no longer identify with this vehicle, with this vessel, this mortal vessel that is influenced by all these subconscious entities known as egos, these desires, these cravings, these aversions, these entities which desire to use and abuse the force in order to gain power. When I realize that I'm here in the service of love, my innermost being and my divine mother, I look across the board and I see clearly now all the egos. You see here, when I'm asleep, I can't see the black pieces. When I'm asleep, I can't see the black pieces. All I see is the world out there, the goody two shoes. And this is me. This is who I am, right? I can't see the black pieces. They're hidden. They're in my subconscious mind. But when I begin to awaken, I see clearly from a very different perspective. I begin to see from the perspective of myself, my true self. And the pieces that I have to work with, that's the vehicle, that's the vessel, and the mind and the heart and the body. And here, the adversary, the real adversary, which is who I was when I'm asleep, or who I am while I'm sleeping. Right? So I am the shadow. That's what you realize when you begin awakening. And this shadow work concept, it's right here. When love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, love is lacking. The one is the shadow of the other. So we have to be honest with ourselves as we observe ourselves. We have to know ourselves, and know ourselves sleeping, and know ourselves awakening, and our true selves versus this self that we identify with, which is the shadow. But what matters to do shadow work is, as we described, you got to go deeper, and you got to go into the analogous ultimate methodology. You have to understand your lust, your fear, your anger, your greed, your envy, your gluttony, your laziness, because these are what cause us to remain trapped in this shadow self and prevent us from being the hero or the sage or whatever it is that we were meant to be, what we were born to be, our true self's purpose. Okay, well, that pretty much brings us to the end here. Does anyone have any questions at this point, or any comments to make, or any? We wanted to give Carl Jung the last word so that you all see that he was a remarkable individual, and he knew, deep down, he knew where he was coming from and where he needed to go. The problem was he was trapped into this conditioning, and even though he knew in his heart of hearts that he shouldn't let the intellect have the final word, but at the end of the day, he let his intellect have the final word, have the final say. And when you run into people talking about, doing the shadow work and wanting to do the shadow work, it's all well and good. Just realize that you are the shadow. You are the shadow that you need to work on. And this work never ends. It never ends. It's the path. The work on our egos is the work on ourselves. It's the path. Jody said, the most interesting and informative discussion lecture. I'm impressed. Well, we're glad that we hope that you got something out of it, that we hope that you put it into practice, hope that you make it work for you. You're welcome. You're welcome, Eric. We love to break bread, and we love to crumble it up and and drop it on the path. Yes, we hope so. We don't want to come across as being harsh on Carl Jung. And we don't want to throw away his theory of archetypes, because there's value to be had there, especially if they help you to better understand yourself, better know yourself. The issue we have is, as you can see, how a lot of people misinterpret what Carl Jung is saying and end up believing that they need to embrace their shadow and integrate their shadow. And yes, it's like a mountain climber. You've used this analogy so many times, or like we talked about last Wednesday when we talked about baffling. Life has to be baffling in order for us to be alive and energized, and for us to become what we can become. Like water needs the baffles to become alive and energized and to achieve its capacity. We need the mountains that we have to climb, and every mountain and every mountain climber will tell you that it's not the mountain you conquer, but yourself. Same with every pianist. Every pianist will tell you it's not the Rachmaninoff piano concerto you conquer, it's yourself. Or the Bach or the Beethoven or whatever the most difficult pieces of music to play are. It's not those pieces of music that you have to conquer, it's yourself that you conquer. And the result is you can become a master of that music. When we hear people talking about integrating their shadow and integrating this and integrating that and say there's no sense of mastery there. The mountain climber conquers the mountain. How does a mountain climber integrate the mountain? To us, that's a mountain climber sitting on the chalet on the deck, sipping hot toddies and admiring the mountain from afar. But that's not a mountain climber, is it? And that's certainly not going to make the mountain climber a master mountaineer. Just saying. But of course, the hero and the villain example is, or the Jedi and the Sith example. And even though in the extended universe there are things called neutral Jedi, gray Jedi, of course the philosophers came along and decided that they're going to, apply their intellect to this archetypal mythology called Star Wars. But the bottom line is Shakespeare, when he says to be or not to be, that is the question. Right? To be your true self or to be the shadow. That's the question. Right? But your true self does not integrate the shadow. Conquers it, masters it, eliminates it. Why? So that he can be. So that we can be one and united. Yug religare. Bound together as one, as the ties that bind. Right? Like the wedding bands. Okay, thank you one and all for joining us. As we see, there's no more questions left. We're going to say goodnight. And we hope to see you all again soon on Friday, if possible. If not, next week. So one and all, thanks again, and inferential peace.